The murder of 18-year-old Anne Stein Geisler in early June 1990, widely known in Denmark as the Carnival murder, remains one of the country's most notorious unsolved crimes. Stein was born into an upper-middle-class family that provided her with stability and opportunity. Her mother, Kirsten, was a prominent figure in the legal and public administration sphere, later serving as an appeals board chief. This background placed Stein in a cultured and well-connected environment where academic success and professional ambition were the norms. She grew up in and around Copenhagen, eventually moving into an apartment in the city's historic Latin Quarter. By 1990, this neighborhood, known locally as the Piss Gutter, was a vibrant bohemian district filled with students, secondhand shops, and cafes, but also home to a rougher edge of dive bars and street-level crime. The neighborhood had been the home of artists and counterculture figures for decades, and it maintained a reputation for self-expression and danger. Living here gave Stein a sense of independence that was uncommon for many teenagers of her era. At the time of her death, Stein was a student at Østerborgade Gymnasium, one of Denmark's oldest and most prestigious upper secondary schools. She was in her final year and was just days away from completing her final exams to receive her student ereksamen, which is comparable to a US high school diploma, allowing her to pursue higher education. Teachers and classmates described Stein as sharp, articulate, and academically gifted. She was not a passive student, but rather a confident and outspoken individual, a trait that fueled her ambition to become a journalist. She sought out mentorship, asked questions about the profession, and was eager to understand how the media shaped public discourse. On the surface, Stein appeared to be a reliable and communicative young woman. She was punctual and always followed through with promises. However, underneath the surface of this seemingly well-adjusted individual was a secret life tucked away in the pages of Stein's diaries. The later investigation cracked open the private world Stein kept hidden from her parents and schoolmates. Her journals painted a picture of a complex emotional life marked by secrets, desires, and the kind of internal conflicts often seen in adolescence. The most significant and troubling revelation in the diary was Stein's relationship with a married, approximately 40-year-old journalist who worked for one of Denmark's leading morning newspapers. This was not a casual romantic encounter or some kind of fleeting teenage crush that passes within weeks. It was instead an intense, emotionally charged affair that consumed much of her attention and emotional energy in her final months. For Stein, the relationship likely represented far more than physical attraction. It was an entry point into the professional world of journalism and media that she aspired to join. She may have believed that intimacy with an established journalist would give her insights into the profession, connections that could help her career, or simple adult validation of her worth as a woman and a thinker. Obviously, the power dynamic inherent in the relationship was stark and troubling. An 18-year-old high school student and an established professional twice her age, in a position of relative power within the media landscape, represented a significant imbalance. Whether Stein fully recognized this at the time remains unclear. What is documented is that the relationship consumed her thoughts and featured prominently in her private writings. Diary entries suggested that the affair was fraught with instances of anxiety, including the constant need for secrecy, broken promises, or unfulfilled expectations, and the looming reality of his existing marriage and family obligations. She documented periods of hope when she believed he might leave his wife or that their relationship might transition into something public, but these were interspersed with periods of doubt, anxiety, and what appeared to be emotional manipulation. In the days and weeks leading up to her death, the emotional tenor of these diary entries shifted toward frustration and uncertainty. Investigators theorized multiple scenarios regarding how the relationship might have become dangerous. One theory suggested that Stein had been pushing for more commitment or clarity, demanding that he choose between her and his marriage, or threatening to expose the affair. Another theory proposed the opposite, that she was attempting to end the relationship, and his reaction to that rejection became violent. A third possibility, less frequently discussed but still considered, was that the affair had ended naturally months earlier and was not directly connected to her death at all, though it may have left her emotionally vulnerable. Complicating matters further was the fact that Stein was simultaneously managing the fallout of a breakup with a boyfriend closer to her own age. The identity of this young man has been protected in most public accounts, but police interviews with him formed part of the initial investigation. Stein and this boyfriend remained on relatively friendly terms after their relationship ended, and they continued to see each other socially. However, the emotional turbulence of managing two very different relationships likely created significant stress. Fast forward to the evening of Monday, June 4th, 1990, activity in Copenhagen was bustling due to the annual festival held alongside Whitsun. The streets of the inner city were packed with thousands of people, the air filled with the sounds of samba drum, shouting, and music that echoed off the narrow buildings. Stein attended a birthday party with friends near the city center, a social gathering that provided a brief retreat from her looming exams and personal drama. Witnesses at the party described Stein as being in a positive mood, socializing normally, and showing no signs of distress or fear. Around 2 a.m. on the morning of June 5th, as the party began to wind down, Stein said goodbye to her friends. The location of her departure was reportedly near Gamel Strand, a central hub close to the canals. From the party, Stein took her bike back home. The ride was relatively short, a journey that would take no more than 10 minutes at a leisurely pace. The route would have taken her through the heart of the Latin Quarter, which would have been alive with the spillover from the carnival even at such a late hour. Reconstructions from investigators suggest Stein arrived home safely, or at least reached her building's perimeter without incident. Her bicycle was later found locked in the courtyard of her building as well, eliminating the possibility of being abducted off the street or being intercepted during her ride. The ground floor included the Tile Inn, a traditional Danish pub and restaurant, while the upper floors were residential apartments. To access the courtyard, residents typically used a gate that opened onto the street. In many Copenhagen buildings of this era, the gate might be locked at night, requiring a key or operate on a timer system that kept it unlocked during business hours. Given the late hour, past 2 a.m., access would theoretically be restricted to residents or those with a key, though the carnival chaos meant that security norms were sometimes relaxed or doors were occasionally propped open. Investigators believe Stein was attacked as she moved from the courtyard toward the back stairs that led up to her apartment. Whether the attacker was lying in wait in the shadows of the courtyard or whether he followed her through the gate just as it closed remains unknown. There were no verified reports of screams heard by neighbors, but many noted that it's possible that any cries or sounds of a struggle were muffled by the carnival sounds in the background. A night watchman later reported that around 2:55 a.m., he saw a man loitering near the entrance of Stein's apartment building, placing the attack window between approximately 2:15 a.m. and 3 a.m. This man was said to be wearing leather pants, had short hair, and seemed to be aimless. This sighting gained traction because witnesses had also reported seeing Stein talking to a man fitting a similar description near her high school in the days prior to the murder, and possibly having lunch with a similar man also wearing leather pants at Cafe Wilder, where she frequented. The recurrence of this specific description suggested a stalker or an acquaintance rather than a random individual, though the man was never definitively identified as the killer. The crime scene itself was not in the open courtyard, but in the building's basement. This area was used as a storage room for beverages and a changing area for staff. Access to this basement was not obvious to the general public, but it could be reached via the backstairs or the courtyard. The fact that the killer took Stein to this specific location implies one of two things. Either the killer knew the basement existed and was unlocked or accessible, suggesting a link to the building, the restaurant, or the neighborhood. Or in a panic, the killer dragged her to the nearest dark door, found it open, and forced her inside to get out of the courtyard. Once inside, the heavy door would have dampened any sound, creating a soundproof chamber just meters beneath the sleeping residents and the busy street. For the entire day of June 5th, 1990, Stein's body lay undiscovered in the cold, gray light of the basement. Her parents, expecting to hear from her after her return from the party, grew increasingly anxious as morning progressed and afternoon arrived without any contact. The sight of her bicycle locked in the courtyard confirmed that she had returned to the building, yet she was not answering the door to her apartment. The family began contacting her school friends, the people they knew she had been with the night before, trying to establish where she was or what might have happened. Police were eventually contacted, though the exact timeline of this notification varies slightly in different accounts. By the afternoon of June 5th, the Copenhagen Police Department was beginning to organize a search for the missing teenager. Around 5 o'clock to 6 p.m. that same day, a female employee of Tegelkrone arrived to prepare for the evening shift. She needed to visit the basement storage area to retrieve supplies. Upon opening the basement door and entering the dimly lit room, she noticed what she believed to be a pile of clothes. As her eyes adjusted and she moved closer, it became clear that what she was looking at was far more disturbing. Lying on the concrete floor was the body of Stein Geisler, partially undressed and bearing unmistakable signs of violence. Forensic pathologists concluded that she had been suffocated. Her hands had been bound using a black electrical cord taken from a lamp in the basement. The cord was also looped around her neck in such a way that movement of the arms could tighten the constriction. In addition, 2 damp dishcloths had been forced deeply into her mouth and throat, completely blocking her airway. More unusual were the actions carried out on the body, presumably after death. A sharp object, possibly a knife or shard of glass, had been used to carve a symbol into the skin of her right forearm. Photographs released by the police showed a crude, scratched pattern interpreted by some as letters, and others as a kind of sign or rune. Another interesting element was the presence of a waxy liquid substance poured over parts of her body. English sources describe the substance as bone wax, which in medical context is a substance used to control bleeding during surgery. Danish reporting, however, clarifies that the substance was floor wax or polish. This substance likely came from cleaning supplies stored in the basement, strongly suggesting that the offender used materials at hand at the scene rather than bringing prepared items. Initially, some commentators and even investigators entertained the possibility that the symbol and the wax pointed to a ritualistic or sadistic motive. Over time, however, many criminal profilers and cold case analysts came to view these elements more as staging or a way of messing with evidence. The floor wax in particular could have been intended to destroy or obscure biological traces such as in saliva or skin cells on the body's surface. The carved symbol, meanwhile, could have acted as a red herring that served no other purpose than to confuse investigators. Early on, some officials and journalists believed the carving might represent the letters PK. The possibility that the killer had signed the crime scene with initials quickly guided suspicion toward individuals whose names would fit. Over time, however, other interpretations emerged. Some argued that the symbol could resemble the letters V and A, potentially referencing Vestamager, a district on the island of Amager associated with certain criminal circles. Others suggested it could be a stylized rune or even an anarchy symbol. Because of the ambiguity, Copenhagen police made the decision to release an image of the symbol to the public, hoping that someone might recognize it as a personal signature, a gang tag, or an identifier used in some subculture. To this day, online discussions of the case often revolve around attempts to reinterpret the symbol's shape, orientation, and stroke order, though no interpretation has ever been confirmed by official sources. Over the years, 4 primary suspects or theories have dominated the investigation. The most compelling and widely discussed theory centers on Marcel Hansen, known in the Danish press as the Amager Man. Hansen is a convicted serial and murderer who operated in the Copenhagen area for over 2 decades before his arrest in 2010. His criminal history and known crimes display a disturbing overlap with the specific details of Stein's murder, leading many experts to view him as the most probable killer. In his crimes, he frequently bound his victims, displaying an attraction toward restraint and domination. In his cases, which numbered in the double digits, Hansen was known for maintaining a calm, controlled demeanor throughout the assault. The hogtie method used on Stein is a highly specific and brutal technique that creates a system in which any movement or struggle results in increasing pressure on the throat. This particular binding method is associated with sadistic offenders who take pleasure in seeing the victim struggle. Hansen is suspected of using this exact technique in other assaults, suggesting a signature or preference that connects multiple crimes. Furthermore, his presence in Copenhagen during the 1990 Whitsun Carnival has been established through witness testimony and investigative work. He was not in prison at that time, and his known movements place him in the city during the relevant period. The carnival itself would have provided him with perfect cover amongst thousands of additional people in the streets, and police were mainly focused on crowd management rather than specific investigations. Despite these similarities and the circumstantial factors pointing toward Hansen, he has never been charged with Stein's murder. The primary hurdle is forensic evidence. The biological material collected from the crime scene in 1990, including samples extracted from the dishcloths, the electrical cord, and other physical evidence, has degraded significantly over the more than 3 decades since the murder. Additionally, the killer's deliberate use of floor wax on the body may have chemically destroyed or obscured skin cells and cellular material that would otherwise have been recoverable and analyzable in modern laboratories. While Hansen is currently serving a life sentence for other crimes, he remains the individual who fits the profile, the geography, and the temporal window perfectly, but who cannot be definitively placed in the basement through modern forensic methods. The second suspect is named Peter Kronholm, aka Mr. Smiley. In the initial years immediately following the murder, police investigation was heavily and intensely directed toward Peter, who was a local criminal known throughout the neighborhood. He was given the nickname due to his ability to manipulate others through superficial charm and a pleasant demeanor that masked a violent and predatory nature. Peter lived in a commune just a few hundred meters from Stein's apartment, placing him within walking distance of the murder location. The primary driver of police suspicion against Peter was the interpretation of the symbol carved on Stein's arm. As mentioned earlier, some believe the carving to represent the letters P and K, which would fit Peter's initials. Police theorized that this carving could represent a sadist's need for ownership and dominance through literally signing the body with his identity, transforming the victim into a canvas bearing his mark. The theory was bolstered by Peter's violent history. In 1994, 4 years after Stein's murder, he was convicted of the murder of his girlfriend Annette Enevoldsen. In this case, he beat her to death with blunt force trauma and then concealed her body by hiding it in a closet. After being convicted of this crime, investigators went back to Stein's 1990 murder and considered Peter as her potential killer. However, as the investigation matured and modern profiling techniques were applied to the case, many criminal psychologists and cold case experts began to seriously doubt the PK interpretation of the carving and, by extension, Peter's guilt in the murder. He was interrogated extensively by police during the initial investigation. However, he maintained his denial of involvement. As for his alibi, accounts in police records indicate that he claimed to be home or somewhere in the city during the hours of the murder, but his alibi was not airtight. No one could definitively confirm his whereabouts during the window in which the murder likely occurred. Critically, however, no forensic trace ever linked him directly to the crime scene. There were no fingerprints in the basement that placed him at Tegelkrone, no fibers from his clothing on Stein's body, and no biological evidence matching him to any of the physical material left at the scene. Without this forensic evidence, the suspicion remained circumstantial. Over the decades, Peter's status in the case gradually dissipated. He remains alive and incarcerated, serving his sentence for the murder of his girlfriend. Modern analysts no longer consider him the primary suspect by most assessments, though he continues to occupy some interest in certain parts of the case. The third suspect we'll discuss was the married journalist with whom Stein was romantically involved. The crime of passion motive was considered strong and compelling by investigators. Stein's diary entries documented emotional turbulence, periods of hope alternating with periods of disappointment and frustration. Multiple theories emerged regarding how the relationship might have become lethal. One scenario theorized that Stein had been pushing for more commitment or clarity from the journalist, perhaps demanding that he leave his wife and family to be with her, or threatening to expose the affair to his spouse and thereby destroy his career and marriage. Another theory proposed the inverse situation, that Stein was attempting to end the relationship, perhaps realizing the impossibility of the situation or the manipulation inherent in it, and the journalist, unable to accept rejection, snapped and became violent. A third possibility, less frequently discussed in the media but still considered by detectives, was that the affair had ended naturally months earlier and had no direct connection to her death at all, though it may have left her emotionally vulnerable and less cautious about personal safety. The journalist was detained and questioned early in the investigation, as were all of Stein's known male contacts. His alibi was provided by his wife, who stated that he was at home with her and that they were asleep together during the critical hours on June 5th. Under normal circumstances, a spousal alibi would be compelling, but these circumstances were anything but normal. The wife would have strong personal motives to protect her husband and prevent the public exposure of infidelity and potential murder. The skepticism about this alibi has been persistent. Spousal alibis are notoriously complex and problematic in criminal investigations. They are subject to unconscious false memory, deliberate lies to protect family reputation, or manipulation. Detectives could find no physical evidence linking the journalist to the crime scene, so the case against him remained circumstantial and unproven. The journalist was eventually cleared of official suspicion and has not been publicly charged or re-examined as a suspect in recent cold case reviews. The fourth individual of interest is the man in the leather pants who was reportedly spotted in Stein's presence on multiple occasions. One such incident was when a man fitting the description got into a heated interaction with Stein at her school. Two other commonly mentioned sightings are, of course, near her apartment on the night of the murder, and then at the cafe that Stein frequented. Copenhagen police made efforts to identify this man, but they proved futile. While some investigators believe the suspect to be his own person, others believe that it could potentially have been Marcel Hansen. But that's nothing more than a theory, and there is no evidence backing the idea that the two were the same person. As of 2025, the case remains technically open, neither solved nor officially inactive. The burrowing burglars case takes place between June 1986 and August 1987. A small crew of highly skilled criminals executed a series of underground bank robberies in Los Angeles that demonstrated exceptional engineering prowess and meticulous planning. The case earned various monikers, including the Hole in the Ground Gang and ultimately the burrowing burglars, with investigators describing it as potentially the crime of the century. What makes this case particularly remarkable is not just the technical brilliance of the crimes, but the fact that, despite extensive investigation by the FBI and LAPD, the perpetrators vanished completely and were never identified or apprehended. The first robbery occurred over the weekend of June 7th to the 9th in 1986 at the First Interstate Bank located in Hollywood. Bank employees arriving for work on Monday morning, June 9th, discovered a small hole described as approximately 18 inches by 18 inches punched through the bottom of the bank vault. The hole was just large enough for one or two individuals to squeeze through and access the vault's contents. This initial discovery was shocking, but what investigators found when they began examining the crime scene was even more astonishing. The perpetrators had constructed a 100-foot-long tunnel from a nearby storm drain directly to the bank vault. This was not a crude, hastily dug passageway, but rather a carefully engineered underground structure that demonstrated significant expertise in soil composition and technical engineering. The tunnel was approximately 3.5 feet wide by 4.5 feet high, large enough for workers to move through, but small enough to maintain structural integrity. Detective Dennis Pagenkop, who led the investigation, noted that when crime scene photos of the core bit holes were shown to professionals in the concrete coring business, they whistled with professional admiration. The tunnels were designed with specific contours and shapes that added extra strength and protection for those digging, indicating knowledge of underground construction principles. The scale of the excavation was immense. Investigators estimated that the crew moved more than 3,000 cubic feet of dirt during the tunneling operation, which would have required approximately 1,500 wheelbarrow trips. The operation likely took weeks, if not months, of work conducted primarily during nighttime hours and weekends when the bank was closed and street traffic was minimal. The burglars also demonstrated ingenuity in disposing of the excavated material. They accessed the storm drain system through manholes, cut through the concrete walls of the drain, and covered the entrance with plywood and fresh mortar after each work session. To clear the accumulating dirt from the storm drain, they employed a clever hydraulic technique. They would dam up the sewer water during their work, then release it at the end of each session. The rush of water was strong enough to sweep the dirt through the drain system, effectively removing evidence of their activities. The crew used a gas-powered generator to provide electricity for their power tools, including electric drills and saws. Bank employees had reported strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to the robbery that, in retrospect, were signs of the impending break-in. The bank experienced unexplained power outages and phone line failures, which investigators later determined were caused by the burglars tapping into the bank's electrical system to power their equipment. The bank's internal Muzak system even kicked in spontaneously late one evening, startling a manager. Perhaps most tellingly, bank staff reported hearing odd grinding sounds coming from the walls and vault area. On multiple occasions, the vault's alarm system went off sporadically without any visible cause. A bank manager working late one night called the central security office to complain about strange grinding noises, but the security guard dismissed it as, quote, just a rat running around inside the walls or something. Some bank employees even began joking about a poltergeist haunting the building. These warnings were ignored because the vault's internal sensors showed no breach, and the security team could find no evidence of attempted entry. The final stage of the operation involved drilling through 18 inches of reinforced concrete and steel to access the vault chamber. The crew initially used a diamond-studded electric drill for this purpose. However, based on the drill patterns and evidence left behind, investigators theorized that the electric drill failed, probably during Memorial Day weekend when the bank was closed for 3 consecutive days, providing an ideal window for the heist. When the power drill died, the burglars had no choice but to continue the work by hand using hand saws and manual drills. The burglars made off with approximately $190,000 in cash from the vault. More significantly, they broke into at least 75 to 100 of the bank's 1,000 safe deposit boxes. Among the stolen items was a sketch of a young girl by French Fauves master Henri Matisse, along with jewelry, rare coins, bonds, and other valuables. The total value of the stolen property, including the contents of the safe deposit boxes, was estimated at more than $2.5 million at face value. However, retired FBI agent Bill Redder, who later analyzed the case, noted an interesting detail. The burglars seemed remarkably inept at actually opening the deposit boxes once inside the vault. They appeared to lack either the tools or the knowledge to properly crack the boxes, and in many instances simply stole the boxes themselves rather than looting them efficiently. Bill estimated that the thieves likely received only pennies on the dollar for the contents when fencing the stolen goods. Of the approximately 114 boxes they targeted, 78 turned out to be completely empty. The burglars left remarkably little evidence at the crime scene. They abandoned some worthless pieces of equipment, including sledgehammers and drills, along with an enormous number of empty styrofoam coffee cups. Notably absent were any fingerprints, DNA evidence, or identifying materials that could lead investigators to the perpetrators. Detective Pagenkop, who headed the LAPD investigation, recalled his reaction upon first seeing the crime scene. He said, "My initial feelings that morning when we first arrived at the scene was one of awe. I realized the fact that these suspects were excellent burglars. They would be extremely difficult to catch. When we concluded our investigation at First Interstate Bank, we were left with no clues at all. There was no physical evidence left. The suspects left us nothing to work with, and we were basically handcuffed." Police searched underground in a 3-mile radius of the bank, exploring Los Angeles' subterranean network of storm drains and sewers, a vast underground highway that runs beneath the city streets. In the weeks and months following the robbery, officials received numerous tips from the public. Some claimed the perpetrators were disgruntled city workers with knowledge of the sewer system, Vietnam War veterans familiar with Viet Cong tunnel digging techniques, actual Viet Cong operatives, or even, quote, a gang of troglodytes, derelicts, and winos who inhabited sewers. None of these leads checked out or produced any viable suspects. More than a year passed with no developments in the case. Then, on Saturday morning, August 22, 1987, the tunneling burglars struck again, or rather, they attempted to. This time, the target was a Bank of America located in West Los Angeles. At approximately 6:30 a.m. on Saturday morning, the bank's alarm system activated. Following standard procedure, security personnel waited for a second alarm before dispatching anyone to investigate. The second alarm went off at 8 a.m., and when the assistant bank manager and security team opened the vault shortly after, they discovered that the vault had been breached. The burglars had successfully tunneled to the vault and cut an 18-inch circular hole through the steel-reinforced concrete floor, but they were interrupted in the middle of the robbery. Evidence suggested they fled in haste, leaving behind stacks of cash, their tools, work clothes, food, and other equipment. Because of the rushed exit, the thieves were only able to leave with approximately $95,000 in cash. The second tunnel demonstrated that the burglars had learned from their first operation and refined their approach. The crew had dug a 60-foot tunnel from a storm drain that ran directly beneath La Cienega Boulevard to the bank vault. This tunnel was considerably larger than the first, measuring approximately 5 feet high by 8 feet wide and supported by strategically placed timber beams. The increased size allowed for better maneuverability and the transport of heavier equipment. Investigators estimated that constructing this tunnel required 4 to 5 weeks of intensive work. The burglars had apparently tapped into the bank's electrical system to provide lighting deep inside the tunnel. When the crew reached the position directly beneath the vault, they employed advanced equipment to break through. They attached a circular cutting tool with diamond-tipped teeth to a special drill, then bolted the drill to the bottom of the floor from below. The generator-driven drill cut through the yard-thick steel concrete floor, producing a perfectly round 18-inch hole that aligned precisely with the center of the vault door, about 3 feet inside the 300-square-foot vault room. The heavy traffic on La Cienega and Pico Boulevards, combined with construction noise from across the street, effectively masked the sound of the drilling operation, making it unlikely that anyone would have heard the work in progress. Inside the vault, police and FBI agents found lighting equipment, a generator, an assortment of cutting tools, including an 18-inch core bit, work clothes, and food. Footprints in the tunnel indicated that the burglars ran through the passageway during their escape, one barefoot and one in stocking feet. The most significant piece of evidence came when investigators discovered 4 ATVs abandoned in storm drains near the scene of the robbery. Detective Pagenkop concluded that the burglars had used these vehicles to transport their heavy equipment through the underground drainage system. The core bit and drill press alone weighed in excess of 100 pounds, making the ATVs essential for the operation. Police began reaching out to ATV dealers in the Los Angeles area and soon made a breakthrough. One dealer recalled a small team of men who had purchased 4 quad runners, describing them as white males in their early 30s with slim and muscular builds dressed in construction-style clothes. The only name investigators obtained in connection with the recovered ATVs was Robert Spaulding, sometimes reported as David Spaulding. However, this was clearly an alias, and a rather cheeky one at that. Spaulding Avenue was one of the cross streets at the location of the first robbery, suggesting the criminals had a sense of humor about their exploits. The address provided was a post office box in Hollywood which led nowhere. Police were unable to develop any usable fingerprints from most of the equipment. However, they did recover one latent fingerprint from one of the quad runners. That print was run through databases and compared with all known arrestees, but no match was ever found, leading investigators to conclude that the individual had never been arrested. Salespeople who had interacted with the man calling himself Robert Spaulding worked with police to create composite sketches. The suspect was described as a white male approximately 35 years of age, about 6 feet in height, and rugged looking as if accustomed to outdoor labor. Despite the distribution of these composite sketches, no one came forward with a positive identification. While investigating the Bank of America burglary, authorities made an astonishing discovery that revealed the true scope of the burglars' ambitions. Approximately 1 to 1.5 miles from the Bank of America, police found a third tunnel, this one completely finished and ending directly beneath the vault of a Union Federal Savings and Loan on Wilshire Boulevard at the corner of La Cienega and Beverly Hills. hills. This 102-foot tunnel was fully constructed and equipped with mounting bolts for drilling equipment already in place under the vault, ready for the final breach. However, the vault had never been entered. Police had to shut down traffic on La Cienega Boulevard for more than 2 hours on a busy summer afternoon to ensure the roadway wasn't at risk of collapsing from the tunnel beneath it. The evidence suggested the burglars were preparing to strike both the Bank of America and the Union Federal Savings and Loan simultaneously, or at least during the same weekend. If they had successfully completed both heists without interruption, the payoff would have been staggering. Detective Pagenkop stated, "If they'd have been able to accomplish both burglaries that week, it's told to me by the people in the banking industry that they probably would have gotten away with between $10 and $25 million. The interrupted second robbery appears to have marked the end of the burrowing burglar's criminal career. Despite having a completed third tunnel ready to go, the crew never struck again. Several factors likely contributed to this decision. First, the narrow escape at the Bank of America probably put the fear of capture into the perpetrators. They had been mere moments away from being trapped inside the vault by police. If their escape had not gone flawlessly, they would certainly have been detained. Second, the massive law enforcement response and extensive media coverage made it clear that authorities were now fully aware of their methods and would be watching for any similar attempts. The FBI and LAPD were conducting extensive underground searches and had assigned significant resources to solving the case. Third, the financial reality may have been sobering. The first heist had netted a substantial amount in valuables, but the second job yielded only about $90K, which had to be divided among at least 2 crew members and likely more. After deducting expenses and factoring in the many days and nights of hard labor required for each job, the return on investment was diminishing. FBI criminal profilers worked with LAPD investigators to develop a working theory about the burglars. They concluded this was a small, tight-knit gang consisting of just 2 to 4 members. Detective Pagenkop believed that 2 men primarily dug the tunnels, with possibly a third person serving as a lookout or coordinator stationed outside the banks. The close coordination required for such operations suggested these individuals had worked together before and had developed significant trust and communication. The case of the burrowing burglars was featured on the February 22, 1989 episode of Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack. By that time, close to 3 years had passed since the first robbery, and all of the investigators' leads had dried up. The case was on the precipice of going cold, and investigators hoped featuring it on the popular television show would attract new leads and tips from viewers. The broadcast did generate a significant response. Tips began pouring into the show's 800 number and law enforcement agencies. However, it was largely more of the same, with tipsters accusing communists, Vietnam veterans, and other perceived sewer dwellers of the crime, but nothing substantive came from the publicity. The crew's disciplined decision to abandon their completed third tunnel and vanish completely after their interrupted second robbery allowed them to evade prosecution and statute of limitations entirely.